Okay, we want to welcome everybody this morning to our webinar recording titled Feeding Low Quality Hay. My name is Jay Stott. I'm the beef educator out of Brown County. Also presenting today is Mariah Woolsencroft. She's out of Nance County, and Ben Beckman. They're both beef educators. Ben's also out of Cedar County. The inspiration for this workshop came about by the amount of rainfall that we received this year. It was above average, and though we usually don't complain about rainfall, the amount we got is presenting its own unique challenges. And so that was kind of our inspiration, and we wanted to think of ways to be able to address low feed quality. During our live presentations, we asked this question to people that were in the audience: what challenges have you faced in growing forage with excessive precipitation? So just think about that for a minute. And Mariah, can you go to the next question? We also asked this question: what challenges do you foresee in meeting nutritional requirements this winter? Think about that for a second. Typical responses that we got were that most people were having a problem either accessing their hay at all because it was so wet, or the overall quality of that hay was lower than usual this year. Most times didn't have a problem with quantity, it was the quality, and that's what inspired this. And so today we want to talk about a few different things as shown on the outline. First is understanding cattle requirements. What is the benchmark? What is the goal that we need to reach? We also want to talk about how we meet those requirements in terms of the feed that we currently have and what we might need to purchase in terms of supplementation to bridge any nutritional deficiencies between what the cows need and what we actually have.
So this is Mariah speaking, and I'm kind of a nutritionist, a ruminant nutritionist by trade. So I get the joys of talking about the requirements. So when I was in school, this was always intriguing to me. It came out of the NRC, and it was adapted about how energy is used within a cow or a horse or any type of animal. And so first thing is we feed our animals. So the first thing we have is intake energy, which is you can sometimes see as IE. And then we lose some energy by fecal. So you can see fecal is being partitioned out from fecal energy. And then once that fecal energy is left, we have digestible energy. So if you get a feed sample back, sometimes it'll have digestible energy on it. And that's just showing what it would be with fecal loss potentially. So we take it a step further, and we have energy, or another loss we have in energy is urine and gaseous. So those are kind of lumped into one pile of losses. And then once those energies are lost, we have metabolizable energy. So it can be seen as ME. We take another step further, and animals can lose energy by heat increment. So that's another step further. We have net energy. So net energy is kind of where we start to partition some of this out. So we have maintenance. So on the left, we have maintenance, and that's just maintaining the body weight that they have, body condition score. And then I like to ask the crowd most of the time what people think production means. And we get some different answers, but what most of the time we get is like lactation, growth. In sheep, there's a wool production aspect of it. So production is kind of a vague answer and is broken out per species of what that means. So in cattle, we're going to be talking about more lactation and pregnancy today. So to go into this a little bit further, Ben and Jace, can you guys see the heading on this? Hello?
Yeah, we can see it. Nutrition for lactating cows.
Okay, I just want to make sure because mine's covered up. Thank you. So to take it a step further, if we look at months since calving, so look at the x-axis really quick. So first month, second month since calving, so on to 12 months is how most of these slides are going to be set up here for a little bit. So think about your calving system, spring or fall calver, and where you guys would be at in this. And then on the y-axis, we're going to look at net energy maintenance required. So we're going to look at maintenance. The small m means maintenance. So to maintain a body weight or body condition score, a cow needs 10.5 milk-cows per day to maintain. So if we throw some production in there, so pregnancy, so as the fetus is growing within the womb, the requirements increase towards the end of the months there. And we're going to add one more bar in here for lactation. So lactation is kind of the big driver when we're looking at maintenance. So we have our pregnancy and our lactation. So we peak about 2 months out on the lactation curve. And then if we put these all together and get an average, so that is the red bar, is the total of all those put together. You can kind of see the curve at the end of month 2, where we have the highest-ish portion of requirements needed because of their milking. And then when we see coming up towards 10, 11, 12 month, that's when pregnancy is going to happen. So we always kind of say, make sure you look at your cattle body condition score 60 days before, because you're wanting to make sure you're meeting those requirements that are increasing there towards the end. So another question that we proposed was, when we start formulating diets, we hear a lot about energy and protein. So we're trying to figure out why we need to formulate a diet for energy or why we need to formulate a diet for protein. And those are determined by forage quality and cow's body condition score. So I have this broken out where energy, if you guys have any feed samples or ever looked at it, you see TDN, NEM, NEG. So NEM is maintenance, NEG is gain. And when energy is a concern is when cows are thin, their body condition score, and when forage availability is limited. So when cows are thinner, so our energy, when it is a concern, is when we need to meet both energy and protein needs. So when the diet needs to be formulated to meet both energy and protein. So on the flip side, if we look at protein, which is seen on the feed tag as crude protein or CP, when protein, supplementing for protein is a concern is when we have adequate forage available and adequate body condition score. So the cows are still looking okay. So when we formulate for protein or when protein is a concern is we do not need to meet energy needs. So that's kind of looking at when we need to be looking at formulating for protein and energy, or when we need to be formulating for protein specifically. Okay, so the other thing we wanted to compare was a cow, because most of the people probably going to be listening to this have cows, but we wanted to compare how a cow's requirements are different than some other beef animals. So you guys have seen the red bar that is placed on the screen right now. That's a cow's requirements total through lactation and pregnancy. And so on the x-axis, we have months since contraception, which would be for the gray, and months since calving, which would be the red one. And we're still looking at net energy maintenance on the y-axis. And so if we look at that, a replacement heifer, which is the gray line, she just is increasing her requirements as she's growing, and then she'll take on to that red curve before long once she gets pregnant. So the other aspect we want to look at was bulls and finishing cattle. And we couldn't really put those all on the same slide with the cows because they have a very different growth curve. So we're looking at net energy maintenance and net maintenance and lactation for cows. And when we're looking at bulls and finishing cattle, we're looking at net energy maintenance and gain. So on the y-axis, you'll see net energy G, which is for gain required instead of the M. And on the other axes, we have shrunk body weight in kilograms, so as they're growing. So you can see that growing bulls are in the gray and growing and finishing cattle are in the red. And they are just continually increased because we want them to get up to the body weight that we want so we can get them to the freezer per se sooner than later. So this is the average curve for growth rate of average daily gain of 2.65 pounds per day. So the other thing that we wanted to look at was crude protein requirements. So this kind of also dictates some of the milk production. So milk production is a big driver of a lot of our requirements. So on the x-axis, we have months since calving. So think back to your spring or fall calvers. And then on the y-axis, we have crude protein. So this is looking at crude protein specifically. And then the yellow is 10 pounds of milk produced. The purple is 20 pounds. And the gray is 30 pounds of milk. So it's kind of a good idea to have an estimate or a way to gauge how much your cattle are milking, because if you look at this graph, the requirements can change drastically from 10 to 30 pounds of milk per day on the requirements. So we want to make sure we're meeting those requirements on those cows so the calves can get the milk that they need. So most of the time I ask what happens there at the 7 months. What's going on that we're all, regardless of milk production happening? And most people say that we're at weaning, and that's absolutely correct. At 7 months, we get to about the weaning stage, and all of those cows, regardless of their milk production, are going to have about the same requirements again until they start producing more milk. So on the flip side, if we look at that on energy, or TDN, as I'll refer to some of it as TDN today, looking at energy requirements. So this is for a 1,200 pound cow for TDN. We still have the x-axis as days since calving, and then the y is TDN percent instead of crude protein, unlike the last slide. And we have the 10 pounds of milk, 20 pounds of milk, or 30 pounds of milk. And so it's similar curve for milk production that we saw in crude protein. And then at 7 months, they're estimating calves are getting weaned. Similar situation. So we're about mid-60s for TDN requirements for a 1,200 pound cow. So the other question I propose to people is, so what are the consequences if we over or underfeed our cows? And we've had some interesting answers, but the main ones that come to my mind is we're losing money if we overfeed, right? We're feeding them too much. If we underfeed, we could be affecting breed back, retaining heifers in the herd or cows in the herd, some similar things like that, which all come back to money, right? So we need to be able to understand where we're at, gauging our milk production, all that type of things, to understand if we're over or under feeding our cows to save us some money. So another thing we talked about was giving requirements of saying, this is what you guys need on crude protein, this is what you need on TDN. But that's kind of hard to do as a nutritionist because there's some other things that come into factors. So I put this slide in there. I want you guys to think about what feeds you have. We'll talk about testing them, but that's something that's important. But as extension people, we're here to help you. So call us. Otherwise, it's very difficult for us to generalize. We need to know what's in your operation as far as feeds, what feed stuffs you have, and then we can go from there and have a better understanding of the diet that we need to formulate for you guys. Okay, and I'm going to pass it on.
So Mariah's just talked about what our requirements are, and now we're going to talk about what we actually have on hand in terms of our feed resources. Next slide. This is a very simple diagram that's showing the relationship between forage quality and quantity as a growing season progresses. And if you'll notice at the early stages, we have an abundance of quality, but our quantity is low. And as the season progresses, that flips. Our quality decreases and our quantity increases. And the trick is finding that sweet spot where those lines intersect. And in my part of the country, in north central Nebraska, that's typically early July to mid-July. That's when a lot of people harvest their hay. But this year was unique. That's kind of got pushed to the end of the growing season. Some people didn't even get to harvest at all. It was an August or September harvest because the conditions were so wet. And based on that, we noticed that they had a fair amount of quantity, but their quality was very decreased. Again, an inspiration for this presentation, this workshop, is looking for ways to address that problem. One other side note, if you are pushed into the corner where you have to harvest late, be sure to be mindful of when your killing frost is. It's a good idea to leave at least 2 or 3 weeks between the time of your killing frost and your last harvest. Those plants need time to regrow leaf material so they can photosynthesize and they can have sugar and carbohydrate storage in the roots to not only survive the summer or the winter, but to be able to have green up the following spring. If you graze or harvest too close to that time, there's not adequate time to gain those storage supplies. And you might see some reductions in your overall yields and quality the following spring. Next slide. This is another very simple diagram. It's showing the relationship between fiber and protein as the season progresses. And again, our quality or our protein's high early on, and then our fiber's low. And as the season progresses, that switches. And that makes sense when you think about a grass plant that you haven't harvested at all the entire year. It gets long, it gets stemmy, it's a lot higher in fiber, lower in protein. Next slide. I want to reference a little side study that I did this year out at the Barter Brothers Ranch that's owned and operated by the University of Nebraska. It's about 35 minutes southeast of Ainsworth, Nebraska. I was looking at the effect of different fertilizer treatments on forage quality and quantity as the growing season progressed. I fertilized fairly early. I fertilized in late March, and when I harvested to a 6-inch stubble height. And that was to try to simulate a very conservative haying or grazing practice. I harvested 4 times during the summer, in mid-June, mid-July, mid-August, mid-September. And additionally, in mid-September, I reharvested my June regrowth. So I wanted to see what the regrowth was going to do. These figures look at my overall production, and there are a few things that we would expect, a few things that were a little bit surprising to me. Overall, you'll notice that the production increases as the season progresses, and that is to be expected. Overall, we saw that our higher fertilizer rates, or 80 pounds of nitrogen, 40 pounds of phosphorus, had higher production early in the season. But what surprised me was by the end of the season, our 40 pounds of nitrogen, so our lower fertilizer rate, had actually caught up with our higher fertilizer rates. It was producing just about as much as our higher fertilizer rates were. Kind of looking at our regrowth, you'll notice when comparing to the control, our fertilizer treatments, there wasn't a lot of difference compared between the control and what they did in terms of the regrowth biomass. Next slide. Also wanted to examine the quality, in both in terms of crude protein and our energy. If you look at the control, that's kind of what you would expect. Higher in the beginning of the season. As the season progresses, it reduces. And for the most part, that held true with the exception of September. We saw an increase in our overall quality in terms of protein. And you'll see this a lot in meadows that are dominated by cool season grasses. By the end of the season, they start growing again, and you'll see an increase in the overall quality. This year in particular, we saw that because we had cool, wet conditions, and it didn't freeze. So the conditions were perfect for cool season growth. And I think that's why we saw such an increase in the protein. Overall, the 40 pounds of nitrogen, if you can go back one more, the 40 pounds of nitrogen had the highest protein, but when you look at the regrowth, it was the lowest. And the higher fertilizer rates had a higher protein on the regrowth, and the control did as well. And that was sort of interesting to me, and I'll talk about a possible reason for that on the next slide. Before I get started, you'll notice I messed up on my y-axis. I have crude protein that is supposed to be percent TDN. We're looking at the energy. And again, when you look at this, the 40 pounds of nitrogen had the highest energy compared to the other treatments. A little bit of surprise to me. But again, when you look at the regrowth, it had the lowest in terms of energy. And we saw that same pattern, the higher fertilizer rates having higher energy and the control having higher energy. And I think that the reason for that is when we fertilize plants, what we're telling them to do is grow really fast. And it's taking all their energy to grow really fast. And so when you get a lower fertilizer rate, like the 40 pounds of nitrogen, there's nothing really left over in terms of the regrowth to go back to the quality of the plant. We have the higher fertilizer rates. They grew really fast, but there was more fertilizer or nutrients available to that plant to store that energy or increase the quality. Then you have the control that was just sort of growing at a normal rate all summer. And because of that, there was more energy available to go back to the quality of that plant. Next slide. So what's the reason for showing all this? And I really had 2 reasons. First, I wanted for people to be able to see on general what the quality in the tonnage of meadow hay was in a growing season, and also whether it's an economical choice to fertilize or not. I averaged all the treatments over the course of the entire season, and I came up with protein at about 6.6%. Again, that's for the entire season average. Our overall energy was about 58%. And then obviously we saw a lot of variation on our productivity depending on what the fertilizer treatment was. In terms of whether it's economical or not, I got the spring fertilized prices for north central Nebraska, and then I was able to calculate that out on a cost per acre. And then in addition, I wanted to see what it would cost for each additional pound per acre and each additional percentage of crude protein per acre over the control. So for instance, if I got 100 more pounds with a fertilizer treatment over the control, what does it cost me to get that 100-pound advantage? Looking at that in terms of what is the most economical choice in terms of quality, it was the 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That was $17 an acre to fertilize, but it was $12.14 for each additional pound of crude protein. That's compared to $41.25 for the 40N 40P and $36.25 for the 80N 40P. In terms of getting biomass, more productivity, the 40 pounds of nitrogen, 40 pounds of phosphorus is the most economical. That was $33 an acre, but that only costed 4 cents for each additional pound over the control. Next slide. So that was for my study on my meadow, but unfortunately that doesn't hold true for all meadows across the state. There is a lot of variation, not only between different parts of the state, but just on different ranches within miles apart, and even on a ranch within different meadows. There's a lot of variation, so it's critical that you test your hays and your forages. All the producers that I know that are serious about feeding, they do this. They understand what the requirements of their cattle are, and they want to know what they currently have and whether they need to supplement to bridge any deficiencies that there might be.
Ben, so something else that we put in here, or we've handed out at the workshops, is meeting these nutrient requirements. There is a NEB guide that has been wrote on meeting or sampling feeds for analysis. So we went ahead and attached what it would look like and where you could find this publication at. It's one that's really good to read. How to sample round bales, how to sample square bales to get a complete analysis. Like I've talked with some of my producers that sampling just the outside of an alfalfa bale, you might miss some of those leaves, which are the nutritional part. So you do need to get a hay probe and sample from the inside. So as a nutritionist, I get the lucky to explain what the difference between dry matter and as-fed is. So I like to explain it. I taught a lot of feeds class in my grad program at Oklahoma State University, and a lot of the youth are not familiar with some of these feed stuff. So I like to explain it as oatmeal is the best way to explain it. So if you go to the store, you buy a box of oatmeal, right? And you're not going to just sit down and eat that by itself. You got to have something in there to make it wet, like milk or water. And so that's kind of how I like to explain dry matter to as-fed. Is the right picture with it in his hands is the dry matter. The as-fed is it coming out of the trailer with all the moisture content in it. So I ask the question to producers of what do we formulate diets in? And some of them kind of look at me like, oh, that's a interesting question. And the answer to that is dry matter. We formulate all of our diets in dry matter, and then they get converted back to as-fed, because that truck of distillers could be a completely different moisture content than the next truck rolling in, depending on how one mill processes it to the other. So that's why we look at the dry matter content, is so it's all on like the even playing field. I'm going to switch screens here really quick, and we're going to talk about how to read a feed label. So give me 1 second to get over here and share this screen. Okay, can you boys see that? I think so. I think I got it shared.
We can see it, Mariah.
Okay, thank you. So like I said, I was in grad school at Oklahoma State University, and these samples came from our feedlot. I worked in the feedlot, and we sent these off to Servitech Labs. And so I want you guys first to locate in the middle of this screen there, the feed stuff is prairie hay. And then if you look up in the top right-hand corner, so don't look below the prairie hay, look in the top right-hand corner for the date reported. On this one is 1/11 of 17. Okay, now just keep that in mind. I'm going to scroll down here a minute, and we're going to look. In the middle here, we have as received and percent dry matter. So when I look at this as a nutritionist, I look at the percent dry matter because that's the even playing field, right? So crude protein and energy, or TDN, are the ones that I look at the most. So the third one down is crude protein. We see it that this one's at 10. If you scroll down and look for the TDN, which is 3 below the crude protein, you're going to see it at 54.3. Okay, so now I'm going to scroll down to a different feed label. Remember that one? Oh, no, it's upside down. Shoot. Okay, so we're just going to roll with it if y'all don't mind. So the date reported, look in the bottom left-hand corner. You see that it's 18 now, 2018. Look at crude protein. I know it's upside down. I apologize. It's 5.8 on a dry matter basis, and the TDN is 49.8. So these came out of the exact same field, 5.8 and 49.8. Let's go back up. They came out of the exact same field. We're fed at the exact same time. So this is saying at 5.8% crude protein, and this one's at 10 from one year to another. Sampling feeds is extremely important so you know where your crude protein and your TDN is at. This can happen from a month-to-month basis or from a year-to-year basis. So it's very hard to estimate what you have if it's a dry year, a wet year. Northern Nebraska had an extremely wet year. Kansas had a super dry year. So even from regionally, from state to state, the percent differences, if you guys are buying hay, is going to be completely different. So something to consider and keep in mind. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint really quick as I continue talking here. And, it took me out of what I wanted here. So we're going to scroll back down really quick. And that was how looking at a feed label. And then the other thing is that we normally hand out at these meetings is this NEB guide that's understanding and using a feed analysis report. So this was a NEB guide written by Rick Rasby, and it's a little bit longer of a NEB guide. It goes through and explains all the different things that can be on an analysis report, from minerals to acid, detergent, fiber, and explains why that's important in a diet and things like that. However, as a nutritionist, my major thing that I'm focused on for most of you guys is that crude protein, that energy aspect. And then if you guys do Google this online, the back page is really important on this because it goes through and explains specifically how those are formulated or how those energy and proteins are utilized. So if you guys get a chance to look these up, I would highly encourage it. They're great NEB guides, a great resource for you guys as producers. And I'm going to pass it off to Ben.
All right. Thank you, Mariah. So I got the fun topic to kind of talk about different things that we can add into our system. We've been talking about understanding where the cow's at, where those nutrient requirements are at. And a lot of us are already growing grass hay. That's kind of the reason that we're here, right, is because we had grass hay. For some reason, we've got either low quality or we don't have as much as we'd like this year. So what are some things that we can shift in our system or add to our system, maybe without going out and actually purchasing additional supplements that we can do to bridge that gap? And one of those things that I think is a really great opportunity here in Nebraska is to talk about crop residues. So a couple questions that I like to ask are, what are cows when you turn them out into a cornfield? For those of you that actually use crop residues in your system already, what are they going after first? And then once we kind of think about that. What are they going after secondary? What are the things that they're leaving and they're not really touching until they really have to? And then finally here, how do we use this to kind of understand and improve our management when we're talking about crop residues? And so to answer these questions, we'll switch to the next slide here. And the things that the animals are going after first are, of course, those things that are of the highest forage quality and the highest nutrient value for those animals. So they're going to go after the grain first. They're going to go after leaves and husks. And really, animals, when we turn them out into a cornfield, or even I've got soybeans up here, they're really not going after that stalk, that leftover plant that's sitting there, even though a lot of times you hear it rephrased to as we're going out and we're grazing corn stalks. The cattle rarely ever are actually eating the corn stalks, and you can really see why there when we're looking at crude protein percentages in that first column, ranges and averages. We're getting pretty low when we're looking at the cob and stalk at 2 and 4% crude protein. Even the husk is a little bit low there. The leaf, the grain, is really where most of that protein's at. When we're looking at TDN, a lot of that's husk, leaf, grain. A lot of the energy's in those top 3 areas. And those are what the cow are going after first. And we need to understand that to manage this system correctly. I pulled this from Extension Circular. If you really want to dive into grazing crop residues, there's a really great Extension Circular down at the bottom. It's EC278, Grazing Crop Residues with Beef Cattle, and it really dives really deep into all the nuances of grazing crop residues. So again, we're talking about grazing the grain. They're going to go after the husk and leaf, and then after that, we're actually going to hit cob and stalk. And if we're getting to the point where we're getting to the cob and stalk, we probably left those cattle out there a little bit too long without giving them any additional supplementation. A couple of other things that we need to consider when we're talking about grazing crop residues. Just like any other plant, whenever we get a drier period, those plants aren't producing as much structural components as they normally would, and actually kind of beefing up a little bit on proteins within that plant. So dryland fields tend to have a little bit higher quality residue than what an irrigated crop field would be. Now, the trade-off with this, of course, is that irrigated fields are going to produce more quality or more quantity of crop residues that we're going to be able to utilize. So while we might have a little bit higher quality in a dry land field, it's really not going to offset the fact that we're going to get up to 2 times more residue when we're looking at an irrigated cropping field. Next slide there, Mariah. Thank you. So we take all this into consideration, and we really have to look at how we're managing animals on crop residues. And what we kind of look at here, this is another graph that I pulled out of an extension circular, that extension circular there. On the X or Y axis I've got over there, that's representing total energy, just a different way of displaying it here. And we look at how that's going over the period of animals grazing on a cornfield. It's really after 20 days dropping off, 30 days, we're getting pretty low there. And if we're pushing 40 days, having animals on one field, there's really going to be not a whole lot left that's going to meet those energy requirements on that field, and we're going to really have to look at supplementation. So what we need to understand when we're working with crop residues is if we can get animals out there quick and fast, and we can move them quickly through maybe a couple of fields that we have, we might not have to supplement. Otherwise, we're going to have to look at some sort of supplementation probably to make sure that we're meeting nutrient requirements. Unless maybe we have totally dry cows, no pregnancy, we're not getting close to that calving period at all. Maybe then we can push that a little bit further, but it's definitely something we need to consider. Another thing that we need to consider, and I don't have a slide on this right now, is just when we're talking about grazing these residues in the winter time, a lot of times snow and ice are going to impact what the cow can get to. So maybe normally we can leave them out in a field for 20 to 30 days and go by just fine. If we have a snowstorm come in and we get, we usually say 6 inches is about the cutoff. Under 6 inches of snow, cow can still get out there and forage fairly okay, be able to get to the residues underneath the snow. Anything over 6 inches, that cow is going to be seeing decreased availability to get to the residues underneath the snow. So if we're getting over that point, we really need to be looking at how do we supplement and how do we make sure that we're getting the requirements to the animal when they're in limited ability to reach the supplement underneath snowy conditions. A common concern that we hear when we're talking about crop residues, especially from folks that maybe aren't grazing their own fields but are renting fields, are yield impacts. A lot of farmers are really worried that we're going to have compaction issues on a field, and that's going to really throw off their crop yields. They're not going to get what they normally get off of that field because we grazed it. The university's done a lot of research on this over the years. We've been doing this for many years, especially down at the Mead research facility down there. And we've got a lot of graphs that look just like this one that we have displayed here. This one's from a Crop Watch article that Mary Dranowski and Darren Redfern put out. But really, grazing crop residues does not cause compaction, does not really dramatically decrease your yield for those crop producers that are worried about that. If there is some compaction, it's probably going to be in that top inch or two of the soil, and by the time we get some freeze and thaw action and we get a little bit of moisture in the spring, that's going to break up really readily. You're going to have a lot greater concern with compaction if you're out there in a wet year and you're harvesting and you're making tracks all over your field with your harvesting equipment. That's going to cause a lot more compaction than your cattle out there under normal circumstances. So when we're talking about grazing crop residues, a lot of times we want to know, exactly how much we have out there. This is a really kind of rough and easy equation that we can use to kind of just get an idea. So you take your total number of corn bushels divided by 3.5, and that gives you roughly grazing days for an average 1,200 pound non-lactating cow. So my corn bushels here in the example, I had 195 on average over an entire field. Divide that by 3.5, and I get roughly 5.5 grazing days per acre for this situation. So that's a really rough and dirty way that we can go about doing that. If you want to get a little bit more into it, go look up this cornstalk grazing calculator. You can find it at beef.unl.edu, and then there's a couple backslashes here, /learning, /cornstalk grazing calc. And this is a really great tool. It's an Excel document, and it goes through all the little details about grazing corn stalks. It'll give you your grazing rate. It'll work in shipping costs if you need to be worried about that, how much you're paying, and really go into all the details that you need to consider when you're working on grazing corn stalks and how that fits into your system. So if you're interested, this is a really great tool that the university's developed that you're able to go and find there. And I also wanted to throw this table up here right now. Again, if you're just wanting to know how many days you can throw animals out there, this is again, a really rough and dirty calculation. We've got corn bushel yield over on the left-hand side, and then animal unit month equivalent, how many 1,200 pound cow per acre for 30 days. A lot of different consistencies there, calves. If we're stocked at 2 calves of 600 pounds. So just kind of give you a rough estimate if you're interested in different systems and how that works with crop residues. Last thing I wanted to talk about with crop residues, like I said, as that system we go a little bit longer on it, we end up usually using up a lot of the higher quality forages or forage available in a cropping residue system. And so we really need to worry about supplementing animals in this system under different circumstances. So if we've got dry cows or spring gestating cows that we really don't have to worry about those late pregnancy requirements, if we're grazing it appropriately, we probably don't need to supplement. If we have thin cows and we want to add a little bit more condition score onto them, we might need to add a little bit of protein to that system to just get them to start fleshing up a little bit. For in late gestation, especially for first calf heifers, because they've got growth requirements for their body and then they've got those gestation requirements, we're probably going to need some additional supplementation for it. Maybe some protein early on, and if we're really leaving them on those stocks for a while, we'll need to look at protein and energy. Lactating cows, because of those high requirements that lactation occurs, we're probably going to need protein and energy supplementation fairly soon into that system to make sure that we're not dropping a lot of body condition score. And then if we're interested in grazing calves, and there's a lot of producers that are actually looking at this and finding it as a pretty viable option. If we want to get greater than a pound a day average daily gain, we're probably going to need some sort of supplementation into that system as well. So that kind of deals with the crop residue side of things. That's something that maybe we didn't have to necessarily plan for. We had low quality hay. We're coming into the fall. That's something we can go out and find and add to our system. Annual forages, cover crops are another option that we can add to our system, but we're probably going to have a little bit of forethought onto this and a little bit of planning. A lot of times if we're out there, we're trying to get that grass hay harvested in July, and that's not happening. Maybe we're pushing into August, late August. It's still not too late if we've got a field and we can use it to plant some cover crops on. That's the time we need to start thinking about this option and how it might work into this system. So we're going to talk about some of the common cover crops that we can use to fit into the system, and then how it supplements what we're dealing with. So a lot of the cover crops that we're going to look at, because we're looking at this, how do we get forages into the system right away, either over that fall period or maybe early spring. We're looking at cool season grasses a lot of times. We're not going to talk about the warm season annuals here, because by the time we've got late hay harvest, it's too late to plant those most times. So spring small grains, we're going to get really good fall growth, not necessarily going to overwinter, but it might fit, that late fall or early fall time period and get us some really good growth there that we can utilize, maybe stretch that, or not be able to have to hay quite as early and stretch that hay that we do have a little bit later into the year. Things like spring wheat, oats, spring triticale, spring barley. Winter small grains, we're maybe not going to get us quite as much fall growth into this system. If we plant them a little bit late, though, they're going to be okay. They're going to overwinter, and we're going to get really good quality spring grazing out of these options. So your rye, winter wheat, winter triticale, a lot of things that we look at in that aspect. Another thing that we might throw into this, just to mix it up a little bit, get a little bit more species diversity and introduce some quality components, are brassicas. So our turnips, our radishes, forage rapeseed, anything like that. They're going to be really high quality and actually pretty high quantity. When you get them in at the right time, you can get a lot of growth off of those. They're going to be really high quality, so to just get total production and kind of balance it out just a little bit, so you're not just wasting a bunch of really high quality forages. If you mix it with the grass, you're going to get your best result there. And those are going to be really good in that fall, early winter grazing period. When we're talking about adding cover crops into our system, we're really looking at if we plant them right and we get the right production scenarios, we can have really high quantities of production here. We're looking at a graph that was done. I think this is coming from Mary Dranowski and Darren Redfern again here. And they're looking cereal rye producing 2 to 8 tons per acre. That's quite a bit of production. We mixed oats and turnip together, and we got 1 to 4 pounds of production. Again, quite a bit of production. And then you go over and you look at your protein contents and your TDNs, really high protein, really high energy. So we've got a really productive, really high quality option that we can possibly, if we think about it ahead of time and we make the plans for it, introduce into our system. In this circumstance, I think they planted these, so rye was planted in September. Oats and brassicas were planted by September 1st, so that late August period. The rye, we've got limited for our fall forage. That 2 to 8 tons is going to count in that spring production that we have there. But again, pretty good protein and energy contents on that rye, especially considering that it's gone through the winter period. Those oats and brassicas, Dr. Janowski and Dr. Redfern have kind of pointed out that they hold their quality really well after that first initial freeze. They might look really crappy. They might, sag down and not look like they're doing a whole lot there. But the quality of that plant after those freezes is still maintained well into January, almost early February sometimes. So if you can get those planted and get them out in a decent amount of time, it's almost worth just letting them grow as much as possible, not necessarily grazing in the fall, and letting them get as much growth as you can off of those species, and then letting them freeze. And once that growth stops, then turning your animals out and utilizing that as a feed source. A couple of drawbacks when we're considering, especially from an agronomic standpoint, of doing annual forages or cover crops. We need to be concerned about spring soil moisture. We're putting a plant into the ground over the winter. They're going to take some moisture to grow. So if we're worried about drought conditions, or we don't have a irrigation system, we might need to worry about that a little bit. Nitrogen is going to be tied up in the organic matter, especially once we terminate that cover crop. So we need to make sure we're putting down some sort of pre-plant nitrogen when we're going in next year, planting our crop. And then make sure that we're using the right herbicide and we're looking for carryover for termination. So we're not planting into a herbicide that's got some good residual and is going to affect our crop establishment the next year. All right, last thing I get to talk about here, or I guess second to last thing, is silage, and we're just going to touch on this a little bit briefly. Again, this is something that we need to plan into our system a little bit. We're going to have to harvest this early, not necessarily an option that we're going to be able to go out and haul around a whole lot. It's going to be pretty expensive if we're trying to haul silage from any sort of distance. But if we've got corn available, maybe this is something that we haven't done in a few years. We need to make sure we're putting up a high quality silage. And to do that, the really key thing is to make sure we've got the right moisture. So next slide there. Right. When we're talking about silage, we've actually got a really high energy content. Protein's, pretty okay there. It's not necessarily going to meet all the animal requirements there on protein, but really high energy, just like any sort of grain that we're looking at, is kind of what we're looking at in the range of silage there. And like I said, proper harvest and storage is critical. Need to make sure that we're fermenting it properly and that we're not getting any spoilage. Otherwise, our TDN and our crude protein are really going to change when we're looking at if we get it too wet, too dry. And if we go on to the next slide here, this kind of shows what we're talking about there. So our kind of sweet spot when we're talking about silage is we want to get anywhere from that, 30% dry matter, 35, so around 70% moisture. Is about ideal. When we start straying too far from that, it gets too wet, we're losing a lot of nutrients. That's when you start seeing those streams running out of your silage pile, and we're just kind of leaching nutrients then. We're not going to get as great a fermentation. If you see all the way over there on the left-hand side, we're throwing off our acids. Those are the critical parts and components when we're looking at making sure we get a really good fermentation. If it gets too dry, on the other hand, here on the right-hand side, we're not going to get the compaction that we need to in that silage pile. It's going to start getting some oxidation, and that's when we're really going to have to worry about molding and getting unstable fermentation on that side of things. For pricing-wise, just again, a really quick and dirty number that we can kind of use, that 7.65 times the bushel price of corn will usually get you pretty close in the ballpark for a price a ton of corn silage. That's just for the silage. That's not any sort of harvest cost or anything like that. All right, final thing we kind of want to talk about a little bit is that meadow regrowth. So we've gone out, maybe we've been able to harvest our hay meadow, not fully, but we've still got quite a bit that we've gotten off finally by this, late in the year. Meadow regrowth, if we've got some period in the fall where it's able to get to it, we're looking at really high quality forage available there. We're looking at, that 10 to 15% crude protein range, really high energy content. Really great resource, and we need to make sure that we're using that appropriately. So how can we be capturing the most energy out of that, putting lactating cows on that, weaned calves, even yearlings, making sure that we're using something that's going to capture that high energy, that high protein, and utilize it. Putting dry cows out on your meadow, maybe if you don't have any place to go with them, that's okay, but we're really missing an opportunity if we're doing that, and we've got other options for that area. When we're talking about meadows, maybe it's been wet, maybe we got out there a little bit late and we can't find a good day to go out and bale. An option we really, I've discussed a lot here in Extension, and we really want to keep throwing out there is windrow grazing. Decreased cost because we're not going out, we're not having to, do that extra pass to get the feed into a bale and then have to go store that and then haul it back out again in the winter. If you look at this graph over here on the right, you can see crude protein. We got windrow in the red, bales in our open circle, and then standing forages in the shaded triangles. And you can really see windrow and bale are holding up there. They both maintain the crude protein content of that harvested forage very well over the course of the year. Our standing, like Jace was talking about there, that really drops off pretty dramatically once we get past the growing season and decreases pretty fast. But if we're doing, windrow grazing, we've got a really great opportunity there to provide that forage to animals without having to worry about going out and bale it. We do need to worry about ice and snow. If we're getting a lot of those, the animals aren't going to be able to get to that windrow as readily as they could. Another thing that we need to worry about with windrow grazing, you can go to the next slide, Mariah, is make sure that we're grazing it right. So you can't just turn those animals out and let them go to the entire field and just have free choice for whatever they do. So what we kind of want to do here is, in this diagram over here on the right, is set up some sort of temporary fence and let those animals have a certain allotment of hay in those windrows. And then once they've used that allotment up, move that fence forward, give them a little bit more. And actually we've done some looks at how much loss we're getting from windrow grazing. And if you're doing it, in a way that you're making them clean up those windrows and use their allotment, we can actually get quite a low loss of our harvested forage there, especially when we look at feeding bales and all the loss that we get from storage. Windrow grazing is a really great option when we're looking at using that resource to the highest of potentials. Final thing that we want to talk about, maybe there's some spots in our meadow that we haven't been able to get to. It was too wet. What are we going to do with those spots? Grazing it, if we can get the animals to go out there, maybe we can provide them some sort of supplement if we're out on those meadows, especially over the winter. They might use it a little bit, but usually this is going to be pretty low quality stuff that's standing out there, and they're not necessarily going to be attracted to it. So we might be able to get them to graze it if we provide some additional supplement, especially late in the season. I think an option that might be worth considering is can you burn that off in the spring? Even if the ground's a little bit wet, if there's enough dry matter up above to carry the fire above where the wet part of the ground might be, we're not usually going to be as concerned about the fire getting away if we're on a wet meadow. We've got that pretty well contained there, and we're going to be able to get that old growth off and then have really good green up and be able to utilize that in the next year as a really good forage resource again, if we can get to it.
So another feed source that's available to many of us is our upland range. Typically we're producing about 2,000 pounds per acre, but that number can vary a lot depending on whether we're going west or east in the state. That varies a lot with rainfall. One thing to keep in mind, there's a lot of variability, just like our hay meadows. Our hay meadows have a lot of variability in the overall quality and production, and that's really important to test our feeds and our upland ranges. That doesn't mean we have to drag a baler out there and get a bale and shove a hay probe in there. We can get a grab sample and send it in and get some idea of what our overall quality is on our feeds. Obviously, as the winter progresses, the quality is going to go down. We're going to look at a slide that goes over that a little bit later. Something else to keep in mind if you are winter grazing your upland range and you do need to supplement, be careful how you feed. I know a lot of people complain about lazy cows, which means if you're feeding every day at the same spot, at the same gate, where do you think your cows are going to be? They're going to be at the gate every day waiting for feed. And that means your cows aren't out capturing that energy for you. They're not out doing the work for you. You have high maintenance cows that are going to cost you a lot of money. So if you do have to supplement while you're using upland range pastures, be strategic in how you do that. You can either go through different fences or through different gates. Be sure to feed in different spots of the pasture. It might take a little bit longer, but it's worth it. You might have a part of the pasture that's a little bit lower quality. That's a good strategy, is to feed on that lower quality. If you have a grass growing, a lot of people don't like little blue stem because it comes in real thick. You can feed on that and able to reduce those stands. Another option is maybe don't supplement every single day. If you can get by every other day or maybe once every 3 days, that kind of keeps your cows guessing and it keeps them out ranging and foraging, which is what we want. Next slide, Mariah. So what is the cost of upland range grazing? This is a little bit interesting, trying to figure out the cost. University of Nebraska every year comes out with an average for rental rates or grazing rates. And unfortunately, they really only give us 2 numbers. They give us cost per pair. And on their publication, they're calling a cow a 1,000-pound animal. And there's not too many 1,000-pound cows anymore. So I calculate it for a 1,200-pound cow and a 300-pound calf. So they'll give you an average for that for a pair during the growing season per month. And they also give you one per acre. Now, given the choice, I always encourage people to do it on a head basis, not on an acre basis. And when you do it on a head basis, it's a little bit more work, but that's a good thing. It forces you to calculate an accurate stocking rate. So if you do it on an acre basis, if I'm leasing my pasture out to someone and I say it's $25 an acre, it's a very real possibility the person I'm leasing to is going to put as many cows as they can on that. And so it's important to try to do it on a head basis whenever possible. So what happens if we have a set of livestock that's not a cow? Say we have some yearlings or smaller. How do we change the cost of that? And remember that how much an animal eats is directly proportional to the size of the animal. So if we have a 1,200-pound cow and we're averaging a 300-pound calf, that's 1,500 pounds. So let's say we have a dry cow during the summertime. We're taking the calf off. That's only 1,200 pounds. You simply take 1,200 divided by the 1,500, which equals 0.8, and you multiply it by that cost, $60, and that gives you a new cost of $48 a head. Keep in mind, though, that this only works to a certain point. So if, for instance, you had a yearling that weighed half of that 1,500 pounds, you would think, well, half of $60 is $30. Well, in my part of the state, you're not going to find very many people that are going to lease out their pasture for $30 a head, even if it's a yearling. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, your yearling is going to keep growing. It's going to get bigger. It's going to eat more as the season progresses. And 2, there's a certain inherent value just for having available land to graze. There's value in that. So typically with my part of the country, with a yearling, you're looking at closer to $40 a head per month. So keep that in mind. And how do we address dormant season grazing? There's a lot of rental questions for dormant season grazing. And though there's not a publication that gives an average on that, just based on the conversations I've had with producers, that typically would drop their summer rate in about $10 to $15. So if you have a dry cow that's 1,200 pounds and you want to graze it during the winter, you take that $48 and drop it another 10 to 15. It's about $33 to $38, and that seems to be pretty typical. But again, this is going to change from different parts of the state, but this is just one way to approach that. Next slide, Brian. Earlier alluded to what is the nutritive values of some of our upland ranges. This data was taken from the Nebraska Ranch Practicum at the Gummins Sandhills Laboratory that the University of Nebraska owns and operates. They took some forage samples and they sampled it in 3 different ways. They took a diet sample, so they took the feed material from the esophagus of a cow, see what it was eating. They took a clip sample, so they just went out, clipped some grass, and sent it in to get tested. They also took a nut ball sample, so they went in the south end of a cow and figured out how it was eaten after it was digested. And so you can see from the figure there's a lot of variability, but if you take the averages of it, if you look at June, the overall crude protein is around 10%. In July, it goes to about 9%. September is about 7%. November is about 5%. And if you do the same thing for the TDN, in June, we're looking at about 61%. In July, it's 58, 59. In September, we're in the 56, 57 range. And in November, we're about 55%. So that gives us an idea of the overall quality of our rangeland grasses as the season progresses. Next slide. So we've talked about what the cows need. We talked about what we currently have available to feed. Now the last phase of the presentation, we're going to talk about what are some possible supplementation sources that we can buy to bridge any deficiencies that we might have. And the first thing I want to talk about is purchased grass hay. And this really depends on what your overall objectives are. I mean, if you have just dry cows, you're trying to get through the winter, and they're only in maybe the first or second trimester of pregnancy, their energy demands are not going to be as high as, say, a lactating cow that's been milking for 2 months when it's at peak demand. So it depends on what you want to do. It's also important that you test the quality of the hay. I mean, if you don't test the quality, you might have gone and bought more hay that's not any better than the stuff that you have. So make sure you know what the quality is and you know that that's going to meet their nutritional requirements. In terms of cost, you can go to the USDA. Every week they'll do a report that gives you the weekly hay prices, and this is an old number I have on here. I checked yesterday for good quality large rounds. The average cost now it's about $85 to $90 per ton, so that has gone down a little bit. Next slide. Another thing to keep in mind is, and we've already alluded to this, is when we are producing our grass hay is that we are monitoring it and we're adaptable. We have the ability to change when we do things. So in my part of the country, everyone hays in early July or early to mid-July, and that's for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is to get more biomass. We talked about that. Another reason is a lot of times the meadows are just too wet to get to before then. But if it's possible, if the conditions are right, you might consider an early haying because as I showed in my previous study, that the quality between June and July, there is a drastic drop in overall quality. So if you're trying to increase your quality, then that might be a good option is to hay earlier in the year in June. Additionally, Ben showed in one of his slides, we have more time for meadow regrowth, and the quality of that regrowth is typically very high, not only in terms of our energy and our protein, but it's more palatable. That's been already harvested once or grazed once, and so we have less stem and more leafy material, so it's a high quality feed. Next slide. The last thing I want to talk about is alfalfa. As a purchase feed source, I really like alfalfa. In terms of its protein, it will give you all you ever need. Most years, it's cost competitive. It's a little higher this year. The number I have for good quality large round bells is 80 to 100. That has changed a little bit. It's now about 90 to 105 per ton. So most years it's a competitive price. This year's it's a little bit higher. One of the downfalls is the energy can be a little bit on the low side. That's something that you need to keep in mind. Another advantage is when cattle get sufficient protein, overall their digestive efficiency increases. And when their digestive efficiency increases, their intake increases. And so a lot of people in a drought situation, they want their grass to stretch, so they'll go supplement a protein tub or a lick tub. And what they're actually doing is you're reducing the amount of time they have to graze because the cows are going to eat more. And what I like about protein is it's not about alfalfa. It's not only a protein source, but it's a roughage source as well. So it helps give a sense of fill to the cattle. So if you have them out grazing, that might help reduce some of their intake on your grasses you have. Disadvantages, you do have to watch for bloat, especially in early bloom alfalfa. If you're going to use alfalfa, be sure to slowly introduce it to the diet. Let the rumen acclimate to that feed. And hopefully, if you keep an eye on them, you can avoid a lot of those problems, but the risk is still there. Next slide.
And this is back to me. So I've talked about distillers grains a little bit. That seems to be a hot topic in Nebraska. Lately, it's a hot topic for the prices going up and people not wanting to feed it as much because the price is going up and getting a little competitive. On here, I have wet distillers grains and dry distillers grains. I don't have modified. Wet distillers grains has a dry matter about 30%, and dry distillers is about 90%. So if I have a choice as a nutritionist, this is the easiest thing for protein for me to go to, because it has a very high protein percent in it. Things to just consider, think about, is storage. If you have the wet, are you feeding it fast enough? Is it molding? Shelf life, how long it's gonna, if you have dry distillers and it's kept in a dry bin, it will last you a long time. And then last thing for you to think about too is phosphorus and what your mineral supplementation process is. And if you're feeding distillers, more than likely you don't need phosphorus in that mineral that you're giving your cattle as well. Here we go. And then I kind of just put this slide together to break down some protein and energy. So when I think about proteins that come to my mind, distillers grains, I said, is my favorite. Cottonseed meal, sunflower meal, canola meal. I know some of these are not in Nebraska, will not be used in Nebraska, but I just put them on here to represent that a lot of the byproducts or the meals or the distillers grains, a byproduct, or a lot of your protein sources. So if you guys ever see anything, you're out looking at the co-op or something like that, or prices are dropping, and you see a meal and it's lower priced, that'd be a good protein source for feeding your cattle. And some of these prices on the right probably have changed since I've updated this last. But just give you guys a rough estimate of what some of those prices are per ton. And then if we look at the bottom, we have our energy, so a lot of the grains. So your corn, your soybeans, your sorghum, your wheat, the whole grains will be your energy source. And I have some of the prices over there, and those have changed probably too. Soybeans are kind of the funny thing. They're high in protein and TDN. So those are an option there too. If you guys want to discuss that further, we can. There's some stipulations with feeding soybeans because they are super high in fat that we need to think about. So there's a couple of options for you guys to start the wheels turning in the head of potentially things that you guys could utilize. So one of the things that I talk about, I'm in central Nebraska, so a lot of my producers like to feed lick tubs, which to each their own. I just wanted to throw this option out there. So I have a friend who works for a company, and he gave me the price and what the feed tag was of a lick tub. So this is a 125-pound lick tub. It costs $80. On the tag, it suggests that 2 are needed in a herd. It didn't say exactly what the herd number was or anything like that. They just said 2 are needed. And then they said cattle will consume 1/2 to 1 pound per head per day, which can also be a very it can vary. That number can vary because if you get a good rain or good snow or something on those lick tubs, they'll kind of turn to water, and so then they can consume more. So that 1/2 to pound can be a very varying source of how much they'll consume. So this it did not fix itself again there, Ben. So on the right, it's actually 25% crude protein. So the protein, the fat, and everything needs to drop down 1. So it's not 25% crude fat. It's actually 25% crude protein, 5% crude fat, 2.5% crude fiber. So everything needs to drop down 1 in that situation. So that's just showing you what the crude fat or crude protein, content is in a lick tub is about 25%. So we're kind of coming to the end here. We've talked about kind of 3 different segments about cow requirements and feeds, how to sample feedstuffs that we have available to us, what our quality of our hay is, and then potentially supplementing with something else. So I kind of like to wrap it up with some of these slides I had in school to show how all this kind of ties in together. So on the x-axis, we have January, February, March, April, May, so on and so forth. So this is set up a little bit different than things I was showing you before. And on the y-axis, we have metabolizable energy. So I talked about cal requirements. So this graph or this line or curve is similar to the one I've already showed you guys. So if we're in March and we're at peak there, that's where we're going to be a spring calving herd. So just think back to that red line that we were talking about at the very beginning. So this is what it looks like, similar to, again, where our requirements are going to be highest. So if we switch it up here a little bit, I know Ben and Jace talked about the forage stuff. So now we're thinking about forages. We still have January through December on the x-axis, and we still have energy on the y. We have our warm and our cool season grasses. So our warm grasses are in the dotted gray line, and our cool are in the striped red. And so if you look at those, where our peak energy is April and May. And then our cool seasons kind of have a late tape, or they have a higher peak again there in September a little bit. So if we throw all three of these together, the cow requirements and our grasses in together, it's kind of interesting. Get some minds going and some wheels turning on some of the producers of their operation and how to utilize some of these forages, when some of these forages need to be harvested, when cows need to be turned out. And if you're fall calving herd, think about moving that line down to, that August, September of your peak. So there's lots of options. I just wanted to propose this up here for you guys to think about, of where you're at in your herd and what works best for you. I did throw one other thing in here because we did talk about that cool seasons annuals that Ben talked about. So like our cover crops would be that dotted yellow line, how that gets thrown into this as well. If that's something that's interesting to you guys, that would meet some of those requirements in there during calving. If your cows are out consuming some of those cool season annuals in that time too. So lots to think about. If you all have questions, let us know. And then Ben is going to take over this last little bit.
So we kind of talked about this whole thing, and we threw a lot of different options out there for everybody to consider. And we just wanted to recognize that we understand that ranching and farming is not a simple decision process. There's no silver bullet when you get into a situation like this. We wanted to throw this graph up here. Just it doesn't necessarily pertain directly with what we've been talking about today, but this is from a publication that talks about some system thinking things and kind of maps out one producer's plan for drought management. And you can see here, it's not one thing. It's how's this going to affect my stocking rates? How's this going to affect the forage production? Is it going to affect my long-term, sustainability, money? How are we going to maintain that herd over a drought? And with all these options that we've been talking about today, we understand that it's a really messy system that you're working with. And so our goal here was to just kind of provide you some different things to think about. We didn't necessarily give you the specifics on everything, and this is how you have to implement every single thing that we talked about. We wanted you to kind of have a cafeteria option to look at a lot of different things. And then if you want to dive deeper into some of these, contact us and ask some questions. So hopefully, if you click next here, Mariah, some things kind of just popped up and made you think about, how are we meeting those requirements? What do we need to make up? And how can we be more cost effective about meeting that gap when we've got low quality hay? How can we cost effectively meet that nutrient requirement gap and make sure that it fits within our system and fits within your vision of the operation? So with that, we just want to thank you for taking some time and listening to us today, talking to us. If you have any questions, feel free to contact your local Nebraska Extension office. We've got beef educators across the state that are going to be really well versed in answering any questions that you have. If you contact your local county office, they'll be able to get you in touch with whoever your local beef systems educator is. Or if you have any specific questions, you can contact me. My name is Ben Beckman. I'm up in Hartington. Phone number and email address are right there.